My name is Lara Merling, and I'm with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this event about the impact of U.S. policy on the global economy. Thanks for those joining us in person and online. And as you know, COVID-19 and Russia's war in Ukraine have caused a shock for the global economy, but the policy response of the United States and other wealthy countries have compounded the impacts of that shock. With a global outlook that continues to look grim, with lower growth for developing countries and the risk of erasing a lot of progress made on poverty and eradicating hunger, we're here to talk today about how the US is impacting these developments and some of the ideas on what can be done to reverse this trend. US policies matter because the US dollar is at the center of the global financial system, and the US is also the majority shareholder and veto holder in international financial institutions. And against this backdrop, I'm happy now to say that our panelists will discuss this more, and that the panel was organized by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Arab Watch Coalition, the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Bretton Woods Project, Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Institute for Policy Studies, Global Economy Problems, it's a long list, and Madrid. And all of us also want to thank Chuy Garcia, Representative Garcia, for being the host of this event. And now with this, it's my pleasure to introduce Victoria Guida, who's going to moderate this.
Thank you so much, Lara. And she laid it out pretty well. I mean, here in the US, we're focused particularly on inflation, and the Federal Reserve has been fighting inflation, but it's easy to forget that all of those types of policies that we use to fight our crises here, those ripple out and affect the rest of the world. And so we have a great panel here today to talk about this. To my left is Jomo, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Malaya. To my right is Mark Weisbrot, who is co-director and co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And then joining us remotely, we have Jayati Ghosh, who is professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So thank you all so much for joining us. And without further ado, I'd love to turn it over first to Jomo.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to Victoria for those kind words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, although the subject I'm going to try to address is not exactly something to be very pleasurable about. I think we basically have a situation where we are sleepwalking into a very, very dangerous. Everybody agrees that there has been very serious returns for arguably a decade and a half. And the global financial crisis, which was triggered by the events of 2008, basically led to a great recession, and we've basically seen relatively tepid, slow economic growth ever since then. The policies of quantitative easing did perhaps ease some of the problems, especially for large corporations, but we also know that the interest rate hikes of the recent period, the last 1 year, have been basically quite contractionary, meaning that they have basically the economy is adversely, economic recovery is adversely affected. Very importantly as well, governments are spending much less and doing much less in terms of trying to help the situation, and investments rates are going down all over the world. Very seriously as well, the situation as far as global warming is adversely affecting countries, especially in the tropical zone. And this obviously affects agricultural production, incomes, and prices. Now, one important thing to consider is that the use of economic sanctions as an instrument of economic warfare has become increasingly normalized in the last 1 year for reasons which we are all familiar with. And these sanctions do not simply affect trade in a very direct sense, but also affect, for example, financial flows in very important ways. Now, I think we have a situation in the world where supply disruptions especially in the recent period, have become quite common. We have seen how climate has affected supply of agricultural products as well as and other products. We've also seen how COVID-19, the pandemic, disrupted trade internationally, production as well as trade in very important ways. And as Lara mentioned in the outset, this has adversely affected world economic output. Now, we also see more recently how economic conflict has affected us, not just in the conflict zones, but more globally, especially with the invasion of Ukraine a year ago. Now, all these supply disruptions have had very important consequences. And in addition, we have seen some very important developments in the world of finance, which have not enabled the economic institutions which have been created to try to pacify the situation. One example, for example, is the development of so-called index commodity speculation. An index commodity speculation, when first introduced decades ago, was intended to smoothen prices in agricultural and other commodity markets. Now, they have precisely the opposite effect, because the index are parts of algorithms which work in ways to accentuate those kinds of disruptions. We also, as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine has affected not only Ukraine, but also Russia and Belarus. The exports of wheat, as well as fuel and fertilizers, have been adversely affected in very, very important ways, because we are talking about significant proportions of world output. So fuel, food, fertilizer supplies have been cut, resulting in higher prices, which are likely to be protracted. And this, of course, has affected prices generally and contributed significantly to inflation, starting particularly around energy and food, which is so fundamental to human life all over the world. And so it has had a more generalized ripple effect. In addition, we have seen how austerity, which has been imposed by various policies all over the world, fiscal austerity, austerity on government spending, has basically adversely affected the ability to deal with the roots of many of these problems. Global warming, for example, the effort to reduce global warming have basically weakened, so much so that the English magazine, The Economist, has basically said, abandon the 1.5 degree Celsius ceiling for temperature rises. We have also seen, for example, the major floods which have taken place in Pakistan. Those floods were so serious that what was previously described when floods happened about less than a decade ago in Pakistan, they were described as once in the century events. This obviously is a very short century, it's not even a decade. We're seeing phenomena like this going to have devastating effects. The intensity of hurricanes, floods, depending which part of the year, basically the same type of phenomena has basically increased, and the consequent devastation has also increased. So we are seeing a situation where billions of people, the welfare of billions of people, are very badly hit, and food insecurity is declining tremendously all over the world. This has been, but prices have begun to creep up again in very important ways. And in fact, the recent year has seen a big bump in prices. We have also seen reduction in humanitarian assistance offered by the rich countries. This has fallen tremendously as the rich countries spend far, far more on military spending. Germany, for example, has tripled its military spending within the last year. Japan has done so over the last six or 7 years since Abe Shinzo became Prime Minister of Japan. And so countries which were basically discouraged because of the experience of the Second World War from military spending have become far more significant. So government military spending going up has basically meant even less money despite budgetary constraints on other things. And the other things are more likely to affect improve human welfare. So we have a situation which is very, very dangerous. In Europe, for example, there has been a return to coal. And it's some of that coal, especially in the former Eastern Europe, is not even what former President Trump would have referred to as clean coal. It's basically full of sulfides and sulfates and affecting people's lives in very, very important ways. Those of you who are older might remember the term acid rain or yellow rain. These were terms which emerged in the 1980s, referring to the sulfide and sulfate content of burning coal. Now, yet another problem, which I think we need to appreciate, is the effect of the increase in some interest rate hikes that have slowed the world economy in important ways. As the announcement for this meeting mentioned, citing the World Bank, and Dr. Weisbrot reminded me of this earlier. Even the World Bank, which has never been critical of the Fed, has basically expressed a great deal of concern about how the world economy is slowing. Different parts of the International Monetary Fund are saying different things, but there is a general consensus that we have an economic downturn. There is some medium-term optimism about this being changing, but there are no grounds for this optimism. Nobody tells us why this situation might reverse itself. So we are in a very, very dangerous situation. Interest rate hikes are slowing the world economy because when the US Fed raises interest rates, everybody else is obliged to raise interest rates. Otherwise, there's going to be a massive outflow of capital, which has already taken place. It's especially serious in so-called emerging markets and developing countries, but it's also happening with Europe and Japan. Japan, interestingly, is the only major economy in the world which has refused to raise interest rates, so far at least. And so we have a situation where we have supply disruptions since the global financial crisis, COVID-19, more recent economic sanctions are pushing what people refer to as cost push inflation, largely relating to supply side disruptions, which I mentioned earlier. So we have a situation where inflation but this inflation we have seen is not contributing to what is called a wage price spiral. On previous occasions, you might have had this kind of relationship between wages and prices. But what we have seen, and CEPR has demonstrated this, Dr. Weisbrot has demonstrated this, over the last half year, since the middle of 2022, there has not been a significant, there continue to be rising prices, but there has been no acceleration in inflation. For those of you who did learn conventional economics in textbooks, you would remember that the concern of most economists is with what is called accelerating inflation. But you don't have accelerating inflation in the US today, or for that matter in the world. So the measures which are being imposed are basically contributing to overkill. So what we have is a significant slowdown of the world economy in very important ways. And let us remember that the so-called 2% inflation target, which many central banks in the world have embraced, is completely arbitrary. It comes from a small country called New Zealand, which 33 years ago, the finance minister said 2%, 2 by 92, referring to 1992. Would make for a great slogan. Would make for a great slogan, and that 2% target has been embraced by central banks of much more significant economies. major conventional economists have all recognized that there is no reason why we should commit ourselves to 2%. But unfortunately, that's the situation in much of the world. I think it's important to remember that most countries in the world, with the possible exception of the US, face many constraints on making economic policy to get themselves out of this situation. And this, I think, is important for us to recognize. So there's no self-correcting mechanism available at national level. Well, there are self-correcting mechanisms at the national level, but there's nothing to ensure that this whole situation will self-correct. So it's very important to recognize the US contribution, and I'm not suggesting a big US conspiracy, but you have a situation where trade liberalization has been reversed since the turn of the century. Investments are being restricted by friendshoring and other policies like that. You have technology wars being waged, particularly with China, but also with others. You have interest rate hikes. You have federal fiscal deficits being tightened. You have geopolitics worsening the situation. And we have developing countries having especially limited policy and fiscal space. The result is that we might well be proceeding, sleepwalking, I would even suggest, towards prolonged stagnation. Let us remember that the last time this happened in the 1980s, Latin America lost over a decade, the so-called lost decade in Latin America. Africa lost a quarter of a century. The consequences this time are likely to be even more devastating because debt is huge and is much, much bigger. A lot of it is private debt, and this is going to be very problematic. Unfortunately, we do not have any significant institutional mechanisms at the world level trying to address this problem. So I do hope that people become much more aware and conscious of this, and we work together to address it, because I don't think this is the basis for continued US hegemony and its efforts to seek and maintain US hegemony in the world either. If you remember what happened the first Cold War, General George Marshall, after which a Marshall Plan was named, made it possible for the world economy to rise together. We need that kind of cooperation for us to move forward together. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I'm happy to be joining you virtually anyway. And I'm actually going to take up on where Jomo has stopped, because I think he's laid out the situation very, very clearly, even though it's a stark and depressing scenario. Jomo talked about, if you like, the sins of commission of the US in the global economy. I'm going to talk about the sins of omission, the things that it could be doing quite easily to resolve some of the challenges that he's outlined, and which it's not. And we can talk about why it's not doing that, but I think it's important to remember that none of these things is that difficult to do. So what are the things it's not doing? Well, first of all of the responses that have come to the challenges that are outlined, whether it is the capital flows out of developing countries, emerging markets, and so-called frontier markets back to the US, whether it's the inadequacy of vaccines that has allowed the pandemic to be so prolonged in different countries, whether it is the unequal fiscal responses, all of these things are things that have met with an extremely slow, sluggish, really, inadequate, and sometimes even wrong response on the part of G7 in particular. And of course, the US is a very critical part of G7. The Europeans have a lot to blame for as well, but the US possibly, in terms of its external policies, has shown that it's not just, that the domestic policy is navel gazing, sure, and it's not looking at the impact on the rest of the world, but even the things that it could do very, very easily, it's either blocking or just simply not doing, okay? So let's take the issue of sovereign debt concerns. I think Jomo highlighted this. We now have the IMF saying at least 58 countries and possibly another 20 are facing severe debt stress on the likelihood of default. In other words, these are countries that are going to be unable to meet their debt commitments, even after they have done everything possible to keep those debts going, to the point where their health spending, education spending, any kind of recovery measures after the pandemic, social protection, all of these things are being cut so that they can pay this debt. And they're still going to be unable to meet these commitments because of that combination, if you like, that sort of tsunami of different adverse forces that they're facing. The trouble is that the debt rescheduling or the debt relief mechanisms are so slow and so unwieldy that they have effectively not worked at all. And G20 has a lot to answer for in this, but so does the IMF. And who controls the IMF effectively? It's US and Europe. Let's not waste too much time about it. And if the US decided to really actively push for debt relief, it could do so. What's particularly significant is that around 40% of the debt held in most of these crisis-ridden countries, in some countries as much as 60% of the debt is held by private creditors, bondholders in particular. And these bonds, it's crazy. It's really very, very hard to get everyone on board. It's almost impossible. You get holdouts and you get all kinds of legal mess. But it can be done if there are regulatory changes, and you need them in just two locations. You need them in the City of London and you need them in New York, because that's where 90% of sovereign debt contracts are created and held. So if you could bring in regulatory changes that force all the creditors to be on the table together, which is done in the US for internal debt. They have different, Chapter 9, Chapter 10, Chapter 11 bankruptcy clauses for internal debt. You don't have anything for the sovereign debt, but you could bring in regulatory changes that force all the creditors to get on the table together and accept haircuts when they're necessary. So something that could be done, it's not even being talked about in the US, I believe. I know Mark is going to talk about really low-hanging fruit that is available in terms of the IMF issuing new liquidity in the form of SDRs, so I'm not going to go there. But another part of the IMF's continuing actions is that even during the pandemic, even during the downswings, it has continued to require fiscal austerity on the countries that are going to it for loans. And that's really awful because, they say, oh, we're trying to protect the social sectors, we're trying to, make sure that the poor are not affected. And obviously that doesn't work. As we speak in Pakistan, the IMF is requiring Pakistan to raise electricity tariffs for farmers and for ordinary people. That's going to cause a lot of poor households to spend half of their current incomes on electricity, on power. It's obviously unfeasible and it's obviously deeply destructive. But you have an IMF that is doing these things. In other words, the overall tenor of IMF programming is still deeply regressive, deeply unfortunate, and does not help countries to grow out of their crisis. It actually pushes them further into it. Once again, the US playing such a critical role in the IMF board of directors and having effective veto power on so many actions could actually make the IMF change that position and could actually move to a different type of approach towards resolving these crises, but it's not happening. The climate challenge, I think Jomo already mentioned this. There is so much that could be done in terms of resources available for dealing with the climate crisis. We're always told we need 2 trillion, 5 trillion, the numbers expand indefinitely. And yet somehow, because there's such large numbers, everyone says, oh, it can't be done, nobody can pay for this, and we'd have to wait for the private sector to come up. And of course, the private sector won't invest because the market incentives are all heavily oriented towards brown investments. Leading the pack is the US, which the IMF estimates is giving 700 billion in direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuels. The global total is nearly 6 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies, direct and indirect, which obviously means that the market incentives are completely skewed away from green investments. But also simple regulatory changes could force private investors to come more to the plate in terms of green investment and away from fossil fuels. But in addition, if you actually use the SDRs that are already available, not just issuing more, which is obviously the best thing to do, but in addition, 650 billion SDRs were issued in 2021. The countries that don't need them got the most. 60% of them went to the rich countries, G7 and so on. They're sitting as empty balances. And the fiscal cost of using them is tiny. 0.8%, I believe, is the current interest rate on these if you actually transform these into dollars? Why are you not simply recycling these into funds that will actually fund major green energy projects across the world? It's so obvious, it's so blatant, and it's so crazy that it's not happening. And there's no demand, again, it seems, within the US to make this happen because it doesn't seem to concern even the population. There really has to be a much wider outcry to force governments to do these things. Loss and damage, adaptation efforts, there is no global fund that is dealing with this. The process of setting it up is so slow that it's ridiculous. The IMF sets up a resilience and sustainability fund, which has a lot of problems in the way it's designed, but it's received $40 billion so far. That's all. When the US share of the SDRs that were created, which it's never going to use, was more than 200 billion. Why is this just being wasted? Why so many wasted opportunities? What I'm really saying is that there are so many errors of omission as well, which suggest a deep lack of responsibility for the rest of the world. And also, of course, the very major errors of commission that have been done, as that Jomo has highlighted very clearly, which really mean that, you don't care about doing things differently, even when it's available, when it can be done. And that has huge consequences for the rest of the world. And those consequences can be extremely damaging, not just to economies and livelihoods, but to the social and political fabric. We don't know how things will play out, but it's a very uncertain time. And all these things will then come back to bite the US economy as well. So in fact, finally, enlightened self-interest should be demanding a much greater recognition of the things it can do, but is not doing, and the things it is doing, which are deeply harmful for the rest of the world. Thanks, let me stop here.
Last but certainly not least, we have Mark.
Thanks everybody for coming here and to the panel. And I'll try to keep my remarks brief as well. I think, we spend a lot of time on the Congress, and this is what I'm going to focus on. And it's because this is the least unaccountable part of our government. And some of you may have experience with that. You get a good bunch of people in your district to meet with your member of Congress. You can very often change their vote and their policy and what they do. And this happened in 2021. I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to take up on one thing that that Jomo mentioned about inflation, because that's where Congress can actually influence the Fed as well, and it has in the past, in the 1990s, for example. And Jomo pointed out that there's no accelerating inflation. There's no self-reinforcing mechanism like a wage price spiral or other. You can also have expectations accelerating inflation, and you don't have that. And in fact, the inflation that you see every day, most in the media, and that almost everybody sees, the 6.5%, is really kind of an artifact. It's not telling you what's going on, the CPI, because that's a year, that's December over December. And if you look at the last 6 months, inflation has been running at an annualized rate of 1.9%. It's actually below the Fed's target. Every economist knows that, but very few people I talk to in the halls of this Congress are really aware of that at this moment. And that's really too bad, because that's 6 months, okay? That's not like 1 month data. Inflation has dropped enormously in the United States and is below target, and we should be thinking like that. So, and because it affects the whole world, as Jomo pointed out. So that's just basic arithmetic. And I want to talk about something else that Congress can do more directly, because Congress did this in 2021. And that is, it can give aid to the world that doesn't cost the US government $1. And that is, it doesn't give the aid, it decides it, because as Jayati mentioned, the US is the decider at the global financial institutions, including the IMF. And it's the US Treasury Department that's right now holding this up, because they have the veto at the IMF. And what they did last year was the Treasury, which can do this without Congress, the Treasury approved $650 billion worth of what are called special drawing rights. Now, this is where people's eyes start to glaze over because it's, the IMF is not a bank and a central bank and it doesn't have money, but it can do so it can't create money like our central bank and the European and Japanese central banks have actually created trillions of dollars since trillions of dollars worth of quantitative easing since the Great Recession. But the IMF can do something very similar, actually, because its credit is so good, because it has $1 trillion of lending power, and nobody thinks they're ever going to, renege on anything. And so what they can do is they create their own internal asset called a special drawing right, which is convertible under IMF rules to hard currency like dollars or euros or yen. And that works. And that worked last year. And over 200 billion of that went to developing countries, not including China. And I'm only excluding China because they can't use these because they have 3 trillion in reserves. And so they can't, they can't do what any country, the other countries can do, which is if they need hard currency, they can take those special drawing rights and they can go to the IMF and say, we need hard currency. And another country, not the US, will step forward. It could be the US sometimes, but it can be anybody, will step forward and give them, exchange that. And the reason they'll exchange that is because anybody can hold this reserve asset at their central bank. And it's just like having US treasuries, okay, or gold, or it's solid. And so that works, okay? It really worked last year. And I want to say, I'll have to talk about the human cost of this because the economics is not enough, all right? In 2021, 5 million children under age 5 died, okay? And we know that there's a relationship between recessions in the world, in the developing world, and mortality. Okay, there's 5 billion people in the developing world, not including China. Here again for the same reasons, and if mortality goes up by one out of 1,000, which is quite possible in the relationships that we see, that's 5 million people. And it's children that are hit the most. And you have, 345 million people now at the World Food Program says are on the brink of starvation. That's up from 120 million before the pandemic. So we're talking about a lot of lives. I would say that probably hundreds of thousands of lives were saved by what the Congress did last year by releasing that money. And just to show you how big it is, by the way, I mean, and Lara has pointed this out, how much it dwarfs all the other forms of proposed debt relief and everything else. But, you could even compare it to all the development aid that the rich countries provide to the developing world in a year. And that money that went to developing countries last year, because of, and I'm going to say this, it's because of the U.S. Congress did. I'll have to get to that in a minute, and the U.S. Treasury. That was as big as all the development aid that goes to developing countries in the year. So that's huge, and it has a huge impact. And here's the other good part of it is there's no loans involved in this. So they're not adding to the debt of developing countries, which, as Jayati mentioned, that already way too much. And it doesn't have, again, as was mentioned, that it doesn't have conditions attached to it, which Jayati made a major point out of, right? That the conditions attached to IMF lending are often quite counterproductive, and so there's no conditions attached to this money, and so that's why we're fighting for this again. And I actually think it's winnable, and I'll get to this. Let me say just a little bit of how it helps and how it works. first of all, they can convert it to hard currency, and we have data now on the 104 countries who actually use their SDRs for various purposes. And, there were some billions that was converted to hard currency, and medicines were bought and other essential needs. And there was also, it was also used to pay off IMF debt. And so we know that it really does help. But it actually does something very powerful that you don't see, which is just by having reserves, countries avoid the kind of balance of payments crises that are devastating. You can get hyperinflation, you can get all kinds of capital flight, which Jomo mentioned already, taking place. And so just getting those reserves for even the countries that don't use it, don't convert it to hard currency, is really a powerful thing, a powerful boost to the world economy that is really getting hit hard. And I want to say also, when the last issuance came out in August of 2021, the world economy was growing at 6%, okay? Pretty good growth. And it grew that year, actually. It came in at 6% that year. And now it's projected, the IMF just the other day said not even half that. And the World Bank said even worse this month. They said 1.7%, which is the worst year we've had in like 30 years, other than the Great Recession and the pandemic recession, basically. So that's horrible. And I won't get into any reasons for the difference between those two projections, but the point is it's really bad either way. So it's much more needed now than it was even in 2021. And why, can I say another thing about it? You can tell me when I'm running out of time. One of the things that this does, and one of the reasons we fought so hard, because the head of the IMF made a speech in March 2020, and she said, hey, the world is short about $2.5 trillion in their basic financing. Use an IMF accounting term, which means what you need to avoid balance of payments or a debt crisis. And so, of course, we went immediately to Congress, and thank you, Chuy Garcia, and the many others who responded and passed 2.8 trillion. They did it twice. And that's why, I have to say, that's why Treasury came up with the money that they did in 2021. And we know that from, various people who worked on this. That's why they did it. And they're blocking it now. That's the problem. And so that was really important. And I think the other part of it is that this is actually winnable again. Okay, it was Congress that did it, and Congress can do it again. Congress has a lot of influence over Treasury through various ways, and they can convince Treasury, if they want to do this again, because there's no downside risk to it. Okay, you can ask Treasury. I mean, they're on the record. They haven't said one word, even though they're opposing this. They haven't said one word about something bad that could happen from doing this the last time or doing this again. And there's really almost no economists. There's really no economists on the record actually saying there's some downside risk to it. So again, it's zero cost to the U.S. government. It's zero debt, zero conditions attached, and no downside risk. And so, why won't they do it? Now, Jayati said something about enlightened self-interest, and that's a big part of this too. First of all, we lost an estimated 2.2 million jobs during the pandemic recession from not from what happened here in the U.S. economy, but from the rest of the world. These were export-related jobs, okay? So these were jobs lost in the U.S. because of the recessions in the rest of the world, all right? And that's a lot of jobs even in the U.S. economy. And so that's part of what we save when we help the rest of the world through this mechanism, again, at no cost to the US. So that's a really big thing for members of Congress. Can tell their constituents on this, and the constituents are telling them, fortunately, why this could help. And here's another interesting thing, and I'm going to end here, because sometimes when Treasury does the wrong thing, it's because there's a powerful influence. It's called Wall Street, but this is not the case. Okay, Wall Street wants this. We got the International Chamber of Commerce among our 100+ organizations representing tens of millions of Americans that fought for this in the last 2.5 years. Okay, or what is it, 23 years, and they're for it, and for obvious enlightened self-interest. They have tens of billions of dollars of sovereign debt that they're holding in the world, and when countries default, they lose money. And so you might wonder, like, why don't they lobby for it too? Because that's and this I can only speculate, and I try to avoid that, but I'm going to say I think it's because of what economists call misaligned incentives, or a principal agent problem in this case as well. You've got people who are working for these big financial corporations, and they got other things they want from Treasury, okay? And so they're not going to get punished if this doesn't happen, even though it would bring their bosses a lot of money, or save them money because of the less defaults on the sovereign debt. So anyway, but I only made that point for one reason, and that is that nobody's going to punish anyone in Washington for doing this. And so that's another reason why I think this is winnable if we work for it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, we covered a lot of ground there. I am going to ask a question, but I do want to say that after we have that initial chat, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. For people who are in the room, you can raise your hand. For people who are online, there's a Q&A box that you could submit questions that we'll also get to. So, but first I did want to ask, I'll start with Jomo, but Mark and Jayati, you can step in too. I did want to ask about this notion of, the Fed's fight against inflation. And, I was struck as, you all were talking about inflation and how the Fed's interest rate hikes hurt the rest of the world. That, I think about, Europe, for example, where over the last decade and a half, we've seen sort of the complexity of trying to set monetary policy for a lot of different countries. And so I'm curious how you think that the US should approach monetary policy in terms of taking into account not just the domestic effect, but sort of the trying to balance all of the different global circumstances and places that might be hurt, or is it just that you think that US monetary policy is also not the right stance for the US, and so maybe the incentives are aligned?
Right. Thank you, Victoria. I think there are at least two major issues involved here. One is that the idea of what is acceptable and unacceptable inflation has changed radically, particularly since the 90s. Before that, very eminent economists, former Fed Vice Chair Stan Fisher, his colleagues at MIT at that time, the chief economist of the World Bank, Michael Bruno, and so on. They all estimate, in their view, inflation rates which would be considered unacceptable today, were all deemed very acceptable. And this was based not on their empirical findings. It wasn't something plucked out of air. And this is where I have to contrast it with this 2% fetish, which, unfortunately policymakers have. It was completely plucked out of air. In fact, the man responsible, the head of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, he actually gave a speech in Washington about 15 years ago, where he described the whole process, a completely arbitrary process of coming up with this 2%. That's bad enough, coming up with this 2% target. But what is worse is how the rest of the world embraced it without any kind of pretense of analytical or empirical rigor. So we are fighting windmills of the mind. You know, we are not quixotic in monetary policy. And it's, you know, you remember that when Volcker raised interest rates in what, 79, 80, 81, it was Reagan who realized that he was going into a very dangerous midterms who reversed him. And this is, you know, this is all a matter of American record. So you don't go, you know, you don't really want to squeeze people. And the last point I would like to make in this connection is remembering Marshall. The Cold War was started. You don't win some kind of international, you know, a very crucial part of support for the US, appreciation for the US and support for the US is because the US is seen as doing something. Okay. And that's exactly what General Marshall did as Secretary of State in the Marshall Plan, right? Lifting up the rest of the world. You don't, now, the perception of the US all over the world on so many different fronts, as I tried to summarize, is unfortunately negative, on at least on the economic front. And I don't think that's a way to use Dale Carnegie's term of winning friends and influencing people. Okay?
Yeah, I think the interests are alike too. It is a heavy lift to try and tell the Fed that they have to care about the rest of the world. So we won't do that so much here. But the fact is, it is the same. And, you know, as Jomo pointed out, as Jomo pointed out, this is, you know, this 2% target. I mean, we have Nobel laureates right now, you know, Krugman, and you have other famous economists, Shah, you know, have been saying that, you know, 3% is a reasonable target. I mean, you know, so yeah, that's part of the story. And the other part of the story is it really, well, I mean, the Fed has literally caused most of the recessions that have taken place since World War II in the United States by raising interest rates. So all economists know that, and that's you know, you don't want that, and they really have made big mistakes, and so yeah, and it really does harm the rest of the world as well. And it was really, you know, that's why we put that quote from the World Bank in there, because as Jomo said, they don't normally criticize U.S. monetary policy, but they did this time. Yeah, there has to be pushback on the Fed here, or we'll get another recession, which a lot of economists are projecting, that was completely unnecessary, like most of the others since World War II, and it brought on by the Federal Reserve. There was, I just made one quote from Rudiger Dornbusch, one famous macro economist here. He said, there was no, he was writing when there were at that time 8 expansions in the US since World War II. He said, not one of them died a natural death. Everyone was murdered by the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both. In fact, if anything, I'm even more extreme. It's not just stupidity, it's class war. That's what it is. There's a notion that, you know, first of all, the current US inflation is not wage driven. It is, yes, supply shock driven in different ways, and it is driven by financial speculation in commodities markets and profiteering of corporations. Instead of dealing with that, you say we're going to use this heavy bludgeon to wipe out wage, to make sure wage demands don't occur. In other words, you're basically using this absolutely outmoded notion that you have to increase the unemployment to reduce inflation. So it's class war. And there's absolutely no reason for it. And what is shocking is that those who are affected don't seem to realize that this is happening precisely for this reason, that this is something they should be actively opposing.
Well, on that note, is there anybody here in the audience that wants to ask a question? We have, I think, about 15 minutes, so we can take a few. In the back, if you want, you can come up here to ask your question, or you can just stand up and
Stand. Yeah.
okay.
So Mark, you just said that almost all of them, at least in the fair. So repeating that to I'm just hoping you can elaborate on it a little bit. And specifically take into consideration, you also saying that it was because interest rates were super low on Greenspan forever that it resulted in crisis in part. So maybe could you expand on that a little bit? We can't keep interest rates at zero.
Sure.
Right? We're talking about that.
So he's asking you, is it possible that, interest rates were held too low and that's why they had to be raised? And yeah, that didn't happen like 8, times, okay? And I have to be, to be more specific, the last 3 recessions were not caused by interest rates rising because, with the Fed raising interest rates, because they had separate causes. 2 unprecedented, the largest asset bubbles in the history of the world burst. First, the housing bubble, and first the stock market bubble in 2000, and then the housing market bubble, which burst and caused the Great Recession. And that's actually something that, is important to understand. It wasn't so much a financial crisis that actually wasn't caused. The Great Recession wasn't caused by a financial crisis. It was really caused by the bursting of this giant asset bubble and the loss of demand from that, from people borrowing against their homes and spending, from construction, from all these parts of the economy that were affected by the bursting of the giant bubble. That's what caused it. So those 2 were caused by the asset bubbles, and then the most recent recession was caused by the pandemic. But almost all of the other ones, really all of them, I'd say, were caused by the Fed raising interest rates, just the way I described. And there isn't any story you can tell that they had to do it for some other reason.
We have a couple of questions from from online that actually I think both are for Mark as well because they're about SDRs. The first one is, if we give SDRs to countries that are in debt to China, wouldn't that help China and encourage Chinese lending? And the second one is, if it's Treasury's decision on SDRs, how would Congress help?
Okay, great questions. So the SDRs are distributed to all countries in proportion to their quotas at the IMF. So the most go to the United States, but we can't really use them either. And so those, 60% that go to the rich countries, it would be better if we changed that rule and, didn't do that, but it doesn't really matter because they're not used. It's just an accounting entry on the books of the rich countries. And so there's no harm in that. So we really, I think, are properly focused on the ones that go to the developing countries who need them and can actually use them. So yeah, China, this is again, I didn't even bother to address the Republican arguments because I don't want to waste your time, but that's really what they're doing. They're just trying to point to enemies of the United, who they hate, and say, well, they're going to get it because everybody gets it. And actually everybody doesn't, and not everybody can use it. We showed this in a paper, even then other countries that are under US sanctions, for example, can't use their SDRs for kind of farts here. So, that's that question. What was the other part of it?
If it's Treasury's decision, how would Congress help?
Oh yeah, Congress helped a lot. As I said, you know, this is from people who were very closely, very involved at the highest levels with what happened in 2021, and they said very clearly that it was the congressional action that convinced Treasury to allocate what they can allocate without congressional approval. And so how can Congress do this? They have many avenues of influence. I mean, one senator can hold up their nominations. I mean, that would be the tough option, but it wouldn't even get to that. I mean, if Congress makes it clear that this is something we want, why are they going to lose something for that? This costs nothing, okay? And there's no downside risk to it. So why wouldn't they do it? If Congress wants it, they have to get along with Congress. They need things from Congress all the time, you know, funding and other things, and not just for them, for the World Bank. And, you know, members of Congress have in the past held up World Bank funding when they wanted something from Treasury. I'm not advocating any particular, strategy or anything. I'm just saying that if Congress tells Treasury, and they made it pretty clear, they passed, again, 4 times as much as Treasury approved. They passed that twice in the House, and we almost got the Senate. I mean, it was pretty close there for a while. There was a Republican senator who was willing to do it. I mean, our coalition that I described visited the 25 Senate offices, and the Republicans were mostly for it until this point. It was after Trump left, actually, that the Republicans in the Congress decided, hey, we can try to weaponize this by running around screaming about all the countries we hate that are going to get this money. And of course, they lie about it. They say this money comes from the US, and we're giving it to everybody we hate. And so this is just a bullshit story, basically, that they're putting out there. But it really doesn't matter.
All right, any other questions in the room?
You mentioned that the commodity index has become counterproductive, and Ms. Ghosh mentioned that one factor in that is speculators. If that's the case, I haven't heard any suggestion or proposal to reduce the influence of speculators on the commodity index.
Can you repeat the question as well?
Yes, certainly. The question is whether or not speculation in commodity markets would basically smoothen price volatility.
No, just the opposite. Speculation is what causes it.
Exactly. And this is due to a phenomenon which begins around the turn of the century, where you have the development of index, basically algorithmic speculation. The structuring of those indices are such that they actually have the opposite effect of what was originally intended by having commodity futures speculation.
So should we get rid of the index?
Sorry?
So should we get rid of the index?
No, the indexes depending on which company you go through, you basically buy indices, and there's nothing to stop companies from offering different types of indexes. So you can go to company A and they will give you, say, a choice of 16 commodities structured in a particular way. A company B might have 20 commodities structured differently, and so on and so forth. But the net effect of this algorithmic speculation is basically to accentuate rather than to smoothen price volatility.
I think he's trying to ask how you would reduce that problem.
Could I add something here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I want to add to what Jomo just said, that, in fact, we should not be having these index funds. I think that's also what the questioner said, because we should not be allowing financial agents into commodity markets. There's really no reason to justify their presence. If futures commodity markets are supposed to be hedging, that is to avoid, to let people manage risk and so on, then only those who have a direct interest in that commodity should be in that exchange. And that was what the original intention of the regulations that were put in the Dodd-Frank law was. The thing is that basically the CFTC and other agents, even before Trump actually, managed to make those rules and regulations so loose that they allowed proxy investors in there, which is why you have banks and financial institutions treating commodities as another asset class. That should not actually be allowed. It serves no purpose. It does nothing. It's a bit like share buybacks. It's a thing that is out there and does harm and has vested interest supporting it, but it does no possible good in any rational sense to the economy or to the different players in it.
Thanks so much. Are there other questions in the room?
There's some more questions online. I don't know if you've seen those. Victoria?
Yes, we have one. I'm interested in if anyone can talk more about some of the positive outcomes of the last allocation, how they were used, impacts on human beings and development, and how that will affect the US. Also, if this is cost-free, what arguments will Congress face vis-a-vis Treasury?
Yeah, so the last part of what arguments will Congress face? Well, I mentioned some of them. The Republicans would say it's going for That's basically the argument. That's all you've really seen. And the first part of that was, what they used for?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
the human benefit.
Yeah, so, some of it was used to import medicines. There were 16 billion that was exchanged for hard currency by 42 countries. There are 104 developing countries that use them. There were, they can also use them and incorporate them into their budgets and use them for fiscal purposes. And that was done by 69 countries. And that was also tens of billions of dollars. And so, I think all of these things had real tangible effects. And again, I have to emphasize that one of the biggest effects that you could estimate it, but isn't obviously visible, is just having those reserves and not having the capital flight, destabilizing of your economy, and even recessions and balance of payments crises that you would have if you didn't have these extra reserves. When a country runs low on international reserves and the international financial system that we have, because it's a dollar-based system where 59% of all the central bank reserves are in dollars. Okay, when you run low on that, you run into trouble. This trouble can really get very bad. It's getting bad for a lot of countries, as we speak. So that's a huge part of it, and it doesn't even require them spending it. Just having those on the books.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there because we're about out of time. I was just writing down, I did hear quite a number of very specific proposals from the panel today, for people to chew on, things like provisions like what we have for bankruptcy, for foreign debt that force all creditors to come together, more SDR issuance, more leeway for inflation, more restrictions on commodity speculation, more green incentives. So, really, really substantive discussion today. Certainly gave me a lot to think about, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks so much to our panel.
Thank you. Bye.